Well, we want to welcome you again for another one of our live streams on the Israel-Gaza war and conflict. This might be number 25 or 26. I'm not sure exactly how many we've had since the October 7th terrorist attack and Israel's response then. But we thought it was important to bring this conversation back to the stage. It's important to continue the conversation going on. To date, 39,900 or more than 39,900 people in Gaza have died. 70% of them are civilians, 2,100 children under the age of 2 have died since the war in Gaza began. 92,000 are reported to be wounded. 1.9 million people are internally displaced. That's over 90% of the population. According to the World Health Organization, from October 7th to July 30th, 500 attacks on health services were reported. According to UNICEF, more than half of the schools used as shelters for the displaced have suffered direct hits in the last 10 months. On August 10th, the Israeli army struck a school in the Daraj neighborhood in Gaza City that was being used as a shelter for hundreds of displaced families. According to reports, the attack happened during morning prayers in the school's prayer area, killing an estimated 90 people, including 11 children and 6 women. We've reported in the past that there's about 20,000 new children with the new acronym WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Thousands have been orphaned. The IDF reports hundreds to thousands are dead. Of course, we suspect that the IDF is underreporting the number of casualties that the Israeli Defense Forces have experienced. The British journal, The Lancet, a medical journal, a highly prestigious medical journal, said that because the number of deaths in war usually are 3 to 4 times the number of casualties that are direct casualties of the war, they estimate that 186,000 people in Gaza will die as a result of the conflict if it were to end today. John Mearsheimer, the great political scientist from the University of Chicago, said that he suspects the number is well over 250,000. The World Health Organization estimates that before the Rafah invasion, about 50 patients exited through the crossing on average each day, and there are currently about 14,000 patients who are in need of medical evacuations, with the number expected to rise given the collapse of the healthcare services, but they're unable to get out. 2 months after the start of the war, United Nations agencies estimated that a third of the residents of northern Gaza Strip suffered from a catastrophic lack of food, and the proportion of children under the age of 2 who were malnourished has reached about 15%. At the same time, many reports were published about Gaza residents who reportedly have been reduced to eating weeds or animal feed, both of which are also scarce, and drinking contaminated water. In March, the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza reported that deaths of 28 children as a result of malnutrition and dehydration. And since then, more cases have been reported. According to an updated report on the IPC index, Gaza's entire population faces imminent famine. Polio has been discovered now in the water, hepatitis A. Reports are saying that this is only the start of the wave of disease. Every university, over 20 have been destroyed. 25 of the 36 hospitals are non-operational. Others are operating at less than 100%. Most government offices have been destroyed in Gaza, 50% of the housing. Estimates are it'll take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. The U.S., of course, sent another $20 billion in foreign aid to Israel just a couple weeks ago. And again, we want to encourage you. We've had more than 25 live streams under the playlist on our YouTube channel, Israel Gaza. We did a 6-part series also on a separate playlist that are kind of addressing the background and the context of this conflict as a whole. But I'm a welcome today with our co-host, Danny. Danny's actually going to host this conversation today because we are actually really excited to bring in a special guest, Dr. Gary Burge. So Gary recently retired from Calvin Seminary, where he was a professor of New Testament and the dean. He previously taught at Wheaton College and graduate school. He's written extensively on the Gospel of John, the historical Jesus, and the contextual and cultural background of the first century Judea as a framework for biblical interpretation. He has several volumes in a wonderful series called the Ancient Context, Ancient Culture series. They're really fun, readable books. They're almost booklets, I think, really, on biblical backgrounds. Of course, he's written a very incredible book called Whose Land, Whose Promise, which is right there in the corner of Gary's head right now. And he's also written a book called Jesus and the Land, both of which are relevant to the present conversation. I want to encourage you to pick those up. We'll put the links to them in the show notes or in the comment box after we're all done. Gary is ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA. He's a frequent speaker at conferences, retreats, and churches. For over 15 years while at Wheaton, he was on the teaching staff of Willow Creek Community Church. He's also deeply invested in the Middle East and his church from Iraq to Egypt and travels there annually. He's often called to interpret the Israel-Palestinian conflict at American churches and denominational settings, and that's why we brought him back again here today. Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be with you, Rob. Looking forward to this. And Danny, nice to be with you too.
Yeah, you too, Gary. Good to meet. We're so glad that you're joining with us again to bring your expertise to all this. So we're going to start with you, Gary. Let's just begin with your thoughts, just general thoughts on all the devastation that has come upon Gaza over the last 10 months. You were in touch at one point with some of the Christians in the north. Have you heard from them? Just give us a real quick summary of where things are, in your opinion.
Yeah, it's really hard to describe. There's no historical precedent for what we have going on right now in Gaza, and it's so deeply troubling. Many of us who travel to the region regularly have a hard time even looking at more and more videos which are coming out of Gaza describing what's going on here. My concern is that we become numb. Sort of you have a news cycle that is inside of typical American media, and the next big story just simply takes over the spaces. And so my worry is that right now that somehow we have become used to this. And so therefore, when another enormous bombing run takes place in Gaza and we have another 500 people killed, we just yawn and move on.
Yeah.
But we just can't do that.
Right.
I'm just frankly delighted to see that so many people have been mobilized in Chicago now at the Democratic National Convention, which is taking place right now. Yeah. And they're saying, look, unless America addresses this policy that President Biden has supported, they just aren't going to vote. Now, this is really significant for Michigan because Michigan, where I am located right now, this is a swing state. And therefore, we have an enormous Arab population south of Detroit. And possibly we're talking about 100,000 votes. Well, that can actually throw Michigan over to former President Trump. So, I think this is a really volatile issue, at least in our current domestic political world. But, what happens in Chicago is nothing compared to what's actually happening over in Gaza. My heart breaks when I see a description or hear a description once again. I don't think we can imagine. We just cannot imagine what Gaza is like today. I've been in Gaza. I have friends who have family members there. It's a moonscape. In one case, a study just recently was published of a refugee camp area. By what I mean by refugee, it was a safe zone. Israel told all of these people, tens of thousands, they had to go pack into this one area, and then they simply started bombing it. And so you have actually overlapping bombing craters inside of this thing, so that you basically are killing as many people as you can. So what we're having right now is, in my mind, Danny, this is no longer Israel fighting against Hamas. I think that's a fiction which Israel wants to give to us. For the first 2 months, I would say, yeah, okay, this is a fight between Hamas and Israel. But this is now evolved into genocide. It really is. Too many people are calling it genocide now. The law faculty at the Boston University just recently published, it is a genocide. Why is that? Because this is the extermination of an entire people in their location, and they are defenseless.
Just let me jump in and ask you to clarify one thing, because when people throw around the term genocide, sometimes people find that inflammatory. And but usually these people come out and call it that. They're working off of the International Criminal Court definitions, things like that. So it might help to just sort of unpack the word for people real quick. Because I think some people hear the word genocide and feel like, oh, that's just an inflammatory exaggeration. What are the criteria for that people are making that claim for?
I'm not sure I can actually recite, maybe Rob can, exactly what the criteria would be. But in my mind, it's a descriptive word, which is helpful to us to say, this is not simply two enemy combatants going at it in a war zone. Instead, what you have is the intentional targeting of a civilian population. And in this case, I think what it is this population is defenseless, and it's war by any means. It is not just bombing. It is not just an infantry attack, but also it is destroying water sources. It's destroying sewage. It's keeping food out. All of these things simply are to kill and starve a population. So for me, wiping out a population like that is something that you just don't simply say, oh, we have a war going on and Hamas is trying to destroy Israel or something like that. Nope, that's not it. That's over. That story is finished. And since January, we have a completely different story.
Okay.
And Dave, just to answer that question briefly, we did address that. We looked at the guidelines for what actually constitutes genocide in one of the earlier live streams. I don't have it handy or what all of them are. One of the difficulties with it, of course, is it doesn't have to be the intent to wipe out the entire population. It just has to be an effort or a desire to do so. But obviously, Israel's going well beyond that. The biggest issue with the idea of genocide has been the fact that you have to have intent to do so. And what the criminal court did, International Criminal Court did initially, or Court of Justice did, is they said, well, you've got statements from Yoav Gallant, you've got statements from Benjamin Netanyahu, you've got statements from ministers of the Israeli cabinet, all saying that that's their desires to wipe it out and to ruin it and to lay it down. So that's the basis of saying this has all the appearance of genocide there. The problem of course, has been, oh, well, that's anti-Semitic and at least all that. But I think Gary's point now is well taken. That is, we've gone past that point now where this is disputed any longer.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
In fact, I would hate to think the discussion of genocide sort of grinds down to a discussion about anti-Semitism. This has nothing to do with the Jewish ethnicity of the IDF. Right. It doesn't about that. This is about one country going after its captive, occupied civilian population and wanting to destroy it. Basically, it is a demographic struggle. That Israel has been in a demographic struggle since its inception, because they have always viewed themselves as a minority inside of their own country. Right now, the country is roughly 50-50, Arab and Jew, the larger Israel. So there are many instances in which Israel has said, we need to change the demographics of this country. So there is a sort of a national strategic motivation to do what is happening now. For those of us who have had the long view on Israel, I don't think we should be surprised.
Well, let's unpack some of the other things that are going, just so people can we'll try to address a few of the questions and things that people raise when we bring a point like this. First of all, there's one of the common arguments is that the official death toll, the reports of destruction, all of the things that Rob recounted for us earlier are highly inflated numbers that can't be trusted because they're reported by Hamas. So how do we respond to this? Can we trust these numbers? Or how are they being verified outside of Hamas's sources? So how can we be sure that this is an accurate picture of what's going on?
Well, for me, I can simply say, first of all, we have been accepting the Hamas government's statistics on health in Gaza for decades. We have to remember that Hamas is the government of the Gaza Strip. It's the government. So that we have conflated something here, and that is to say, we are saying, like Israel wants us to say, that Hamas represents everyone who's a terrorist, everyone who is trying to attack Israel. If you were working for Sewage Corporation, or if you were working for water sanitation, water purification, or you're working at a library, you'd be working with Hamas. Hamas actually is responsible for the medical system inside of the country as well. So Hamas just simply is the government that was voted in. So therefore, since we have had a long track record, and health organizations around the world have regularly accepted that the professionals who are inside of the Gaza medical institutions are giving a fair reporting from what they're seeing inside of their hospitals, why should we distrust that now? When I find out that reasonable organizations that are not necessarily pro-Gaza, like the New York Times, accepts these numbers, then I have cause to think that perhaps these numbers are accurate. When Reuters will accept these numbers, I have cause to think, well, okay, they're accurate. Having said that, even if we were to say, okay, inflated by 10 or 20%, let's just give that away if we had to. It doesn't make any difference. You still are looking at a catastrophic slaughtering, a horrific slaughtering of people here. So this is just simply a deflection that is by the Israeli Ministry of they really have a Ministry of I call it propaganda. It's a ministry that produces information for export inside of the country. What you have here is the Israeli military trying to obfuscate exactly what's going on inside there. So when you say 40,000, they simply say, oh, it's exaggerated. Well, okay, then let's take it down to 35 or 30,000. Is that still acceptable? No, it isn't acceptable. So I think this is a distraction, and we should not permit anyone to distract us. I think the most important thing in my mind is what Rob mentioned at the very top of this, and that is the Lancet recently came out, and John Mearsheimer and a number of other people have come out, and they've said the death toll is not simply going to be those who have been bombed or shot. The death toll is going to be the consequences that come out of this.
Right.
We're going to see disease at an unprecedented scale. Yeah. When you starve a population this severely, the children and the elderly are the first to go. And so therefore, they are going to be incapable of resisting diseases you and I, who are well-fed, are going to be able to resist. So before this whole thing is over, we are going to see staggering numbers. And the question is, at what point will the Israeli civilian population have their consciences struck? When is it, will they look at this and they'll say, oh my gosh, we have gone so far over the line. We no longer really should be standing among the nations for whom order and morality exists. That's why I think we need to name this in the most severe terms.
Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. And on the last point that Gary just brought up, I think Gary, an article was shared with both of us in a group chat that we were in, that Israel, actually, the people in Israel don't know what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah,
their media is not telling them. So you hope that that's where they get to, but I think a lot of them just simply aren't knowing. Just like we don't really know what's going on in Russia and Ukraine because our media doesn't want to tell us unless it's something that they want us to know. But one of the things that was interesting, Danny, we did a live stream a couple weeks ago.
Before you go further, let me just go back to that a minute. The parallel that someone gave to us, a real expert, a leading evangelical Christian expert on this whole conflict, was in conversation with Rob and me and some others. And she was saying that the real parallel here, the Israelis do not know. They do not see the things that we see. Yep. And the parallel is Russia. Russia does not see what's going on in Ukraine.
Correct.
Because the government is concerned that if they were to see what's happening in Ukraine, there would be protest. So it isn't as if the Israeli government is, as it were, controlling the media there. There is simply pressure inside of the country not to show things which are unpopular. Right. In my memory, since I'm kind of an old guy now, back to the Vietnam War, we did not put on television the things that are actually happening in the Vietnam War. Why? Because it would have been unpopular and people would have just turned us off. So that's what happens. You think that you have the public seeing everything that goes on. No, on the contrary, we don't.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, Gary. I do think that the situation in Israel is a little unique in some of the literature I've read, and that is that they have been so traumatized. Yeah. I've seen some Jewish literature saying that I can't look at it. I can't see it. I don't know what to do with it, and I can't. Yep. So I think there's a little bit of that trauma that's been inflicted on them as well. Right. But we had a live stream, Gary, a few weeks ago. Danny and I did with a couple Jewish interlocutors that you're well acquainted with as well. And one of the questions I asked them was, I said, you question these numbers. He questioned the numbers. He said, Rob, when you say 39,000 people have died, that's when they want to come to my synagogue and burn it down. And I didn't challenge him on that at all, but because my point was, well, my question was, is what Israel doing, is that actually leading to anti-Semitism? And was this Israel at fault, or responsible for some of the anti-Semitism that you're experiencing around the world because they're taking it on Jews for what the nation of Israel is doing? And my first thought was, well, even if the number's wrong, if it was only 20,000 dead in Gaza, would they still want to burn your synagogue down? And it doesn't. Right. Your point is well, it doesn't really matter. But the reality in terms of the numbers is that the numbers are probably very likely accurate because Hamas, they have a militant wing, as you described, but they also have just the governmental agencies that are responsible for this. Right. And they have a name for every single dead person that they have on the list.
That's right.
They have 39,000 names, it's not just a made up number. Yeah. And furthermore, every time a war with Israel and Gaza has happened, and there's been 3 prior to this over the last 15, 20 years, the numbers that come out from Hamas and the numbers that come out from Israel are almost always pretty close anyway. So the numbers are very likely, very reliable, and the numbers don't include the people that are missing under the rubble, the people that have not been accounted for as well. So I think, this issue is, and again, we're way past the point where it doesn't even matter any longer.
All right, let me pick up on the next, just kind of move on a little bit here. Some is a very, very important criticism of the criticism of the Israel thing, and that is this, and that is that the entity that is most morally culpable for the destruction in Gaza is Hamas itself, because they've embedded themselves in civilian populations, they've embedded themselves in schools and hospitals. They have publicly, their leaders are quoted as we're willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of people for the cause, so that the moral culpability for the destruction actually weighs more heavily on, or at least in great part, on Hamas itself because of their conduct in this. Just want to, Gary, respond to that, and then Rob, you can take your turn after that on what you guys think about that.
Yeah, with all respect, I completely disagree with the premise, because I think this is simply a feature of Israeli propaganda inside of this war. Every country that prosecutes a war is going to have an information sort of engine that is producing a kind of version of events. And here in this case, what Israel needs to do for its own population in the world is to dehumanize the Palestinian in Gaza. And then what he needs to do in that propaganda machine is to shift blame for all of these deaths to the victims of the bombing and so forth. So what you have here is just a remarkable, blaming the victim. So in some sense that they're responsible for what is happening here. Now, let me just sort of take a couple of angles on this. First of all, this whole business, we imagine then that there's a crowd of 5,000 Gazans who are somewhere in the sand, and then a member of the Hamas military branch goes into the middle of them and shoots off a rocket. That's not exactly how it's happening at all. So Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, the many on-the-ground organizations that have been working with the medical services, they have openly disputed this. They say, no, this is not happening at all. The problem is that the people who belong to the Hamas military wing, they are regular citizens that are inside of the country. And so therefore, what happens is they may be living inside of these dense urban areas, yet they might be gathering elsewhere in order to conduct their assaults on Israel. Okay, so here's my question, and that is this. If someone who does belong to Hamas military wing, but we're just talking about anyone, I guess, from Israel's point of view and Hamas, and they are actually living with their families inside of a building, is it legitimate for Israel then to bomb the building? In other words, is that embeddedness? I mean, this simply, and Israel is going to say, well, again and again, they say this, we actually have got a kill ratio that we're willing to live with. People who are working inside of Israel's targeting inside of the military have come out and confidentially reported that this is a common practice. If there are 2 maybe families with Hamas fighters living inside of a building, they prefer to actually come at night, and they're willing to sacrifice 200 or 300 people in order to kill those 2. So therefore, let's just imagine if you do have Hamas fighters who are inside of a community of people, when does that kill ratio become reprehensible? Let's just grant this. Let's just imagine the worst case scenario. Let's just say for a moment that you have 4 Hamas, men who are about to shoot a rocket, and they happen to be embedded in, let's just say, 2,000 Gazan refugees. Let's just set that up for a moment. Is it legitimate for Israel to drop a 2,000-pound bomb, creating a massive crater right in the middle of those 2,000 people? At what point does the kill ratio, proportionality, become absolutely obscene? So granting their premise, I'm going to say, nevertheless, I don't think you can do the kinds of things Israel is doing, even if it were true. But I'm questioning even if that is true.
Rob, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think that's well stated, Gary. I think I've heard this many times, and obviously we continue to hear it. I just was shown a video from Prager University, which I had not been very well acquainted with. It said, I'm going to explain the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's really easy to explain. Easy to explain. It's hard to come up with a solution. I'm thinking, if you think this is easy to explain, you already have a problem to begin with. But he started off by saying one side wants to kill the other and the other side wants to live in peace. I'm just like, okay, this is ridiculous. Just the way he framed the whole conversation. We've heard from the past as well that international military organizations are studying the IDF's assault on Gaza to learn how to do a ground invasion well. It's the most moral army in history, which I think a moral army is a little bit of an oxymoron to begin with. But the problem with that is that Gary's point's well taken. It can't account for a large number of these attacks. They've destroyed every university in Gaza. They've destroyed 25 out of 36 hospitals in Gaza. They've destroyed every governmental building in Gaza. They've destroyed 50% of the housing in Gaza. 166 journalists have been targeted, right? And then as I opened up at the beginning, there was an attack on August 10th that a school was bombed where displaced persons were residing. 90 were killed during morning prayers. There's just too many of these attacks. The International Kitchen, whatever that was, the food kitchen. There's just too many of these attacks that have happened that you got 40,000 people dead, 70% are women and children. That's 28,000 women and children. That doesn't make any sense. And I guess Gary's point of it's the law of proportionality, as we had the discussion in one of our earlier live streams. The idea is simply to put it this way: you can't go into a school and say, you know what, there's an active shooter in here. Let's just take all the children out because we're going to get that shooter. You can't do that. You can't go into a bank and say, well, they got some hostages, but we're going to get those. They're never going to rob a bank again. We're taking them out. There's civilians here. And again, we condemn Hamas because they killed civilians too, but Israel's killing civilians at a rate that's just unacceptable.
Rob, the other thing is that I think this is the death toll is really can be fairly easily explained because I've been doing some work on the weapons that Israel has been using. Let me just give a little background to this, and I think it might be helpful.
Sure.
There is a series of bombs that the United States makes. It's called the Mark 80 family of bombs. There are 4 of them. The Mark 81 is a 500-pound bomb. There's a Mark 82. That's you can have a 750-pound bomb. Mark 83 is a 1,000-pound bomb. Anyway, these are all bombs, and the usual military bomb that you put out there is about a 500-pound bomb, Mark 81. Now, what happened is that the United States also produces what's called a Mark 84. And the Mark 84 carries just a whopping 2,000 pounds of explosive. It's just astonishing. And the United States does not use a Mark 84, also called a JDAM, a Mark 84 inside of urban settings. It is just too explosive. It uses it for things like bridges, for military compounds that are hardened really well, or when there's things underground in Afghanistan, when they had very deep tunnels they wanted to go after, then a Mark 84 was called in. Anyway, this is astonishing to me. The United States has shipped 14,000, now hear that, 14,000 2,000-pound Mark 84s into the Gaza battle zone. Now, we might think, well, okay, so what's that going to be about? This has become Israel's weapon of choice. Yeah. The United States has said, you are not supposed to use these in urban centers, but we have never had any disciplining of this. Now, let me just explain for a moment what happens when a Mark 84 goes off, and I think this explains quite a bit. When the Mark 84 is dropped, 950 pounds of explosives go off, and there is an 8,500-degree fireball that creates this incredible shockwave that just blows through the entire vicinity that it is. It's about a quarter mile is the destructive area. It's moving at 6,000 feet per second. Now, this immediately, what it does is it throws 10,000 pounds of soil and debris into the air, and it creates a 20-foot crater. It's amazing. Now, the thing that they're seeing in the hospitals is this. when you drop a Mark 84 into an urban center, what it does is it pulverizes the cement. It doesn't simply blow up and the building comes down. It pulverizes the cement and turns it into a weapon. So what happens is you have millions and millions, billions of small granules of cement that fly for a quarter of a mile. So what they're seeing inside of the hospitals are people whose bodies are completely riddled. Their skin is filled with cement. And it's impossible to actually heal them unless they took off all of their skin. You can't. And immediately what happens is that an infection sets up and they die. And so there's just no way to survive this kind of thing. So a really, really fair question is this. How is it that legitimately, morally, Israel can drop a Mark 84? They've got 14,000 in their arsenal. How can they drop Mark 84s right there inside of urban centers? And why doesn't the United States say you can't do things like that? Now, let me just take this from bad to worse, okay? The Mark 84 used to be a dumb bomb, meaning it just was dropped and you hoped it got within near range of the target. Today, Boeing and Texas Instruments has actually made it a smart bomb so they can knock it right on target. So it's just pretty remarkable. I know how effective it can be. Anyway, CNN did a study of bombing photography, which is inside of Gaza. And in one area of Gaza, they counted 1,900 major craters, okay? And 500 of them left behind the signature 40-foot diameter sort of crater that it creates. And immediately they knew, CNN says, these are Mark 84s, and they're being dropped with overlapping perimeters, so that what you can do is create this remarkable space in order to kill everything inside of it. Let me take it to the last step. In an elementary school last month, there were people who were packed into this elementary school, and Israel didn't simply drop a JDAM or a Mark 84. Israel dropped 3 of them simultaneously. 3 Mark 84s simultaneously on a school in Gaza? Are you kidding me? Now, the United States wouldn't use one weapon like that on an urban center, and Israel's using 3 in a shot? At some point, we have to ask ourselves, there are hard questions to be answered here that have to do with proportionality, of course, but Israel has made the Mark 84 2,000-pound bomb the weapon of choice inside of Gaza, and it is the wrong weapon for the job. And they are using it indiscriminately. And that is why we're seeing the kinds of casualty rates that we are. The death toll simply climbs rapidly when you drop Mark 84s inside.
I'm trying to learn here too, Gary. Is there justification for this because of the hardened tunnel systems underneath this? They built this massive, supposed mass reinforced tunnel system underneath of civilian populations in place, where they conduct their movement of military troops and equipment, and therefore it's going to take something like this to get down to that level to combat the Hamas group, Hamas military.
Yeah, that would be a very predictable sort of Israeli question about this. That would be their response. However, we have all this evidence of Mark 84 craters, which are all over these areas, which are simply population areas. We have them also inside of cities. And in some cases, they blow up above the ground. So what they're really doing is targeting the buildings which are around them. But let me just again, Danny, just grant that premise for a moment and say, okay, so there's a tunnel system inside of Gaza City, and it's moving between these buildings, which are all residential. And let's say Israel wants to go after that tunnel system. Is this the moral way to go after a tunnel system? Yeah. You drop a couple of 2,000-pound bombs right on the tunnel system, and you wipe out all of these residential buildings? No, there are other ways that you can go after those tunnel systems, and that is this is simply the conduct of war without conscience. Yeah. This is industrial killing, you might say, and we haven't even yet talked about Israel's targeting practices. They are now using AI on the battlefield, and if Rob wants to go into that, I'm now pretty aware of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for
No,
that.
no, Gary, I didn't think either one of us ever dreamed that we would be experts on bombs.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
but
Right.
one of the things that we heard at the beginning of this whole conflict was the fact that Israel has all smart bombs. They're guided, and they always hit their targets. I was in a conversation with some Jewish leaders, and that was their whole justification. And the reality is actually only 40% of their bombs are smart bombs.
Yeah,
The rest of them
but
are
it's
dumb
collateral
bombs.
damage. Why are you having so much collateral damage? Is
Yeah, and
because
even if smart bombs and a 2,000-pound bomb it doesn't matter
Yeah.
matter anyways at all.
even
So
if you get your target, if your target comes with 500 dead civilians, so
right,
how is that moral?
right, yeah. Let me interrupt really quickly here,
Yeah.
Gary. And we want to just remind you that thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments box. We'll do our best to get to them. We have a lot to discuss with Gary here still, and want to thank him for his time. But Determined Truth is a 501c3 nonprofit. We do all that we do. Everything that we do is free of charge. We don't charge for anything we do. The 100 pastors in India that we work with every week, live streams, podcasts, blogs, everything is free of charge. We can only do this with support from you. So if you'll be happy to go on the Determined Truth website and give a donation, whatever, that's fine. We'd appreciate it. Make sure you choose Rob, Danny, Vinny, whatever it might be, so the money gets to where it goes to as well. And then we want to encourage you to sign up for the Determined Truth YouTube page, subscribe, like the page, share the page, and comment. All that helps the algorithm so that the videos get seen by more and more people. So I want to thank you for all that. Yeah,
there's two more follow-up areas. One I think we've covered already, but just give you a chance to wrap it up a little bit more if there's anything else you want to say. And that's it. One of the common talking points is that Israel is justified because to do this as an act of self-defense. And the nations have a right to defend themselves and after the October 7th. But the October 7th is put in the context, at least from the defense of Israel side, that it's part of October 7th was just the latest in as part of a philosophy of Israel does not have the right to exist. Therefore, they have this never-ending enemy. They have to defend themselves. So we've talked about proportionality already some, but I just wonder, just comment a little bit, if we can, on the whole thing that Israel is acting in self-defense, has a right to. They have this existential threat on all sides, from Hezbollah, from Hamas, and ultimately from Iran. Therefore, this is justified and necessary for their own security.
Right. I think that whenever we're looking at a major conflict like this, what we have to ask ourselves is, when did the conflict begin? If you asked me, Danny, when did World War II begin? If you simply said, well, the fall of 1939, when Germany goes into Poland, that would be a mistake. You would have to go back further than 1939 to really understand what happened there. So therefore, when somebody says to me, well, gosh, this all began on October 7, I'm saying not so fast, because what I want to know is, what were the conditions, what were the contexts that actually led to this kind of explosion? What if someone suggested that this was actually a resistance movement? This is an explosion that came out of Gaza, because Gaza itself is the byproduct of Israeli occupation and oppression that has gone on for a very, very long time. Let me just give you an example. What we call Gaza Strip today is completely artificial. It was created by the Israelis. Right. But actually, the British precinct of Gaza was something much larger. It had about 60 villages inside of it. And when Israel conquered this whole area right through like 1967, those villages were emptied. And so what happened were all of these people were pressed into this area. And Gaza itself then had a fence put up around it, and they're packed in. That's why about 75% of the people in Gaza are refugees. They had lost all of their homes. Israel created the conditions in which they packed all of these refugees into Gaza. And then what happened were all of these 60 villages, they are occupied by Israeli settlers, and they're taken and developed. Now, what happens is, inside of Gaza, you have all of these families who the grandparents remember their homes, and they tell their kids, and they tell their grandchildren their homes. Mm. But it's not only that the Gazans themselves have experienced this remarkable oppression from Israel, but for the last 16 years, they have been under a blockade. And so the Israelis have actually controlled the amount of food that goes in, the amount of construction materials that will go in, whether or not you can fish out off the coast. They can't control their airspace. Again and again, the Israelis then have been squeezing Gaza for 16 years. And there have been people inside of Israel who have said, you keep squeezing and squeezing, and ultimately it is going to explode. So I guess the hard question I want to ask is this. When a people have been occupied long enough, do they not have the right to resist? Do they not have the right to fight back against their occupier? And I think if we go back in American history, we could say to ourselves, no, that's something that not only might be true. What you have here in Gaza is the explosion of anger and fear and desperation and hopelessness. But those are conditions that have been produced by Israel, oh my goodness, for the last 50 years. Yeah. So it isn't like out of the blue, someone in Hamas said, hey, it's time for us to destroy Israel. No, this is like a friend of mine in Palestine said to me, when you're dead already, you're not afraid to die. And the people in Gaza have been made to feel that they're as good as dead.
Yeah, I think again, I'm playing devil's advocate here just to clarify, because you're doing a great job of clarifying it. They would take then this right to defend themselves further back and saying, because Israel, all the way since its inception, has always lived under this their perceived existential threat to their existence, that even the occupation and oppression was an act of self-defense because of this long-standing commitment from the Arab world to challenge Israel's right to exist and to ultimately to destroy them. So, I mean, obviously, we don't need to go back and unpack the entire history of the region. We've done that in other episodes. But I do think that there's a sense in which people on the Israeli side, Justification, also go back in that history and say, from the beginning, we lived under this threat of annihilation from the Arab world around us. Mm-hmm. So therefore, all of these acts that we've done in terms of what you call oppression are actually acts of self-defense because we feel this threat all around us. And
Danny, I know that argument. And again, I just simply won't grant the premise because what you had is certainly a major conflict in 1948, which was the byproduct of the dissolution of the colonial period. We expect that kind of thing. Israel's flag goes up. Israel immediately produces 750,000 refugees, pushes them out of the country. Okay, so even though they produced that many refugees, that sense of let's annihilate Israel isn't something that really is the way that Israel would want to frame it today. After the War of 1967, when Israel took the Golan Heights and Gaza, took the Sinai and all of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, after the War of 1967, there were Israeli military planners who were saying, if we hold on to all of this territory and we are generating more refugees, we may have gone too far. Right. And what this did is place refugees in the surrounding Arab countries, angry refugees inside of Israel, so that today there is this sense not of destroying Israel per se, but it's destroying this kind of ethnocentric, militarized Israel, which is dominating the entire landscape. Keep in mind that 50% of the people living inside of Greater Israel, they're Arabs, and yet they are told they are less than second-class citizens. So how does that have a future? That does not have a future. So I think if you were Israeli living in Tel Aviv, yeah, you would have this sense of siege today. You certainly would. And that's why this October 7th is so traumatic, because it actually gives full form to the very nightmare Israelis have always had. But I'm asking, to what extent has Israel been culpable in creating that nightmare themselves? Was it possible before 1967 to create a country, or after 67, in which there would be two nations living side by side? The Israelis would say, nope, impossible. There are other voices that say, no, actually, it was possible, but Israel chose the path of occupation instead.
Yeah. Rob, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, that's well stated, Gary. And I think you've always have two narratives, and within two narratives, of course, there's always a justification for each of the narratives, and there's always radicals on extremists on every side of the narratives. So they're actually, each narrative is multi-narratival there as well. But Gary and I were talking last week as we were preparing for this, and I mentioned to him, that one of the narratives, of course, is that the Palestinians are oppressed. They live under the heavy hand of Israeli occupation. They suffer the loss of land, ethnic cleansing since 1948, and what have you. And then the Israeli answer is, yeah, but we need to have this because we need a homeland where we can live in peace and safety for ourselves, make our own laws, no more pogroms, no more Holocaust. And the Arabs haven't welcomed us in here, and they just did violence against us. So we have to hold them down and whatever so that they don't act out against us. So we're justified in this heavy-handedness. And I think what we're seeing play out is the fact that the Palestinian narrative seems to get more and more justified by the fact that Israel has seemingly from the beginning wanted all of the land. And now at least a contingency of those who want all the land are now in power with Benjamin Netanyahu and are actually carrying it out. And they're doing it. And they are doing what the early Zionists in the late 1800s, early 1900s said they wanted to do, which we didn't think that they're never going to do that. They're going to live side by side. Ben Gurion and the first prime minister of Israel, they made all these statements like, well, we'll concede. We'll let them have the West Bank and Gaza for now. But the thought was maybe later on they'll go full force. And it seems like this is playing out. So the other thing is the fact that it's not true to say that all the Palestinians don't want to live in peace with Israel. The PLO renounced terrorism. The PLO acknowledged Israel's right to exist. And Hamas has actually had several charters that said, if you do this, we will acknowledge your right to exist. The problem, of course, for Hamas, for that is that one of Hamas's like non-negotiables is the return of the 750,000, refugees, which is now like 5 million. And Israel's just never going to go for that. It's never going to happen. But nonetheless, Hamas has had a charter that said we'll do this. And again, whether you trust that or not, but the reality is that what's happening now, and the West Bank is on fire. We'll get to that, I think, in just a minute. And the radical growth of the settler movement all along since 67. Gary mentioned the 67 war. Really, let me comment really briefly. 3 months after the 67 war, in June of 1967, 3 months later, Israel started building settlements in the West Bank. Settlements are Israeli populations, Israeli housing, Israeli citizens moving into Palestinian territories. If you want peace, then that land has to be set aside for a Palestinian country or nation or whatever it's going to be, a Palestinian state. It makes no sense to me at all to say that they've been wanting peace since 67 because they haven't stopped the settlement process since 67. They haven't slowed it down at all, and they've obviously accelerated it quite a bit.
Go ahead,
Rob,
Gary.
let me just sort of toss in this one other thing. My concern actually now, Rob and Danny, is that I think this entire conflict with Gaza is going to backfire on Israel.
Yeah, I think so.
It's tragic, of course, for the Gazans, but I think it's really going to turn out to be really tragic for Israel. I am reading American Jewish voices who are saying, look, things like this. This war has either changed the Israelis, who now have become so eager for revenge and violence, or it has unmasked us, but we don't know who we are anymore. This is not the Israel that we recognize. And so not only do you have an internal sort of profound questions that may ultimately be asked, if there are 200,000 dead people inside of Gaza, and Israel itself does not have a moral awakening, then you have to expect something is deeply wrong inside of this country. But American Jews are really wondering if their support, if Zionism in the form you see it in Israel really represents Judaism, they're asking hard questions about that. You see protests on university campuses all over the world, and you see nations of the world now standing up and saying, this is genocide. In other words, Israel is paying a steep price for what they are doing, and I'm not sure they realize how high that price is going to be ultimately. And I think it's going to be tragic in the long run for Israel.
Well, we're going to wrap.
I'm sorry, Danny. I would add it's also going to be tragic for the United States as well.
Yeah.
The question is, does the United States have a moral conscience? Either. We're giving them the bombs. I can't hear another word from Biden saying, we're trying to get a ceasefire. All you have to do to get a ceasefire is stop sending them weapons. Yeah. And they just sent $20 billion, I think, in the last couple of weeks. This is ridiculous. So does the United States have a moral conscience? And here's the other part that's really important for us as well, and that is the world out there looks at the West as not having a moral conscience, and they associate that with Christianity as well.
Oh yeah.
And so
That's
now
right.
the question is, does the church have a moral conscience? I think.
All right, Danny's been trying to get in here.
Yeah,
no. I just a couple. We're going before we run out of time. I wanted something you alluded to. I just wanted to get a little bit more highlight to, because I think most people in the U.S. don't pay attention to what's going on in the West Bank and the settlement movement and the settler violence. The settler violence. I wondered, Gary, if you could just give us a really quick overview, summary of what's going on in that whole settler movement and the settler violence that's skyrocketed since October 7th.
Yeah. So for those who are just getting used to this argument, we tend to have the habit of throwing around numbers, and the numbers just become a big mashup for us sometimes. But essentially, what happened was in 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank. That's all that land between, say, Jerusalem and the Jordan River. It was densely Palestinian. It was really intended for the Palestinian state. After 1967, as Rob said, they began moving settlers in, and these settlements now are deemed to be illegal by the United Nations General Assembly. Again and again, we have said that it was American policy that these settlements should not be there.
Right.
It violates the Geneva Convention, which says the origin of European wars. If you conquer people and move them out, you cannot move your own people into that land to take their homes, their land, and so forth.
Right.
That just leads to another war.
Right.
Okay, so now what we have are thousands of Israeli settlers, which are really like colonial settlers, is what they are. They've moved in. In some cases, they've just confiscated Palestinian land. They're living alongside Palestinian villagers. Roughly 2.5 million, 2.7 million Palestinians are in the West Bank. So you have these thousands of Israeli settlers that are just living among them. But what's happening now, because of this conservative government, they feel they have license to come out of these settlements, and they're fully armed. The current government has fully armed these people, automatic weapons, the whole works. And then they have face masks on. And they come to a Palestinian village or a farmhouse or something like that. Yeah. And what they do is they use Molotov cocktails. They shoot things. They destroy the windows, destroy the cars. They set things on fire. And if there's any resistance, you have people being shot, murdered, frankly. And we have hundreds of cases of these murders taking place in the West Bank. Rob, correct me here. I think it's 500 so far this year. Is that right?
I don't know the number.
Yeah. So anyway, so you have these astonishing cases, and you might ask yourself, well, wait a minute, where are the police? Who's in charge up here? The Israeli military oversees the West Bank, but these same eyewitnesses are saying the military just stands on the sidelines.
Yes.
Yeah. So the project here is very simple. The project is the settler movement inside of the West Bank wants to depopulate the West Bank, to make the West Bank so unpleasant, so uncomfortable, so uninhabitable that the Palestinians who live there are finally going to say, that's it, we're leaving. We're going to Jordan. We're going wherever we're going to go, and the settlers can take their land. So this has been going on under the radar. The news barely covers it. Yeah. It has been going on since October 7th. There has been more illegal occupation of Palestinian land and the murdering of Palestinian villagers in the West Bank than we've ever seen before. Right. And yet it's not being covered in the Western press.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming up close to our end time, but I want to give an opportunity for each of you to just say, in conclusion, if you could say one thing that you want to convey, or one or two things, or the core message to the American church here, and what do you think is there a path forward? And what can we be advocating for? I think particularly as followers of Jesus in this, and concerned about what it looks like for us to follow Jesus in these difficult times. One of the things that Rob and I have tried to really emphasize this year is, what does it look like that? Let's ask ourselves the hard question. So in summary, you got a closing statement maybe, or some idea about what's the path forward? What do we want to take away from this?
Yeah. Well, for me, Danny, I think what has happened in the evangelical American church is that we are passionate about the fulfillment of prophecy, about eschatology, about somehow this is a playing board on which God is making the final moves of history. And I think we have let our eschatology get in front of our ethics. So no longer are we operating with conscience. We are actually operating inside of the Christian church with a kind of misplaced zeal that in some manner God wants these atrocities to go forward. So I guess my concern is that the American Evangelical Church has become immune to violence, has become sort of incapable of feeling anything when they see the slaughter of all of these people. And if that's the case, if that's what happens, the consequences for the American church will be severe. In other words, a whole generation of young people especially are going to rise up in America, and they're going to look at how the American church was silent during this kind of atrocity, and they're going to ask why. The same thing happened in Europe during World War II. The church was silent when they should have spoken against sort of the Nazi invasions. And so therefore, the German church lost its credibility. This is a moment. We are at a turning point in American evangelicalism. And we have decided that our passion for the fulfillment of prophecy is more dramatic and exciting than the horror of a 2,000-pound bomb hitting a building filled with families.
Yeah. Rob, you want to have a last word there too?
You're muted.
Rob. Yeah, you're muted. Rob, you're muted. Rob, you're muted.
I had to mute myself because my ear thing stopped working. So sorry about that. That was well stated. I don't really have much to add. Next week, we do have a live stream coming up with James McCarty, a professor at Boston University, who edited a book called The Business of War. And I think this is one of the things that we have to understand, the fact that our American democracy has been taken over by corporate dollars, and those corporate dollars are the ones who are financing war. And they have our congressmen in their pockets, they have our presidency in their pockets, and the American people are listening to the propaganda that comes about because it's funding corporations, and people are making money off of this, and people are dying, and the church has got to stand up and say no.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah, I want to give my thanks to both of you. My role in this thing was just to facilitate, but also to learn. I feel like in some ways I'm a bit representative of the audience that we're trying to reach, in the sense that for a good bit of my adult life, I was somewhat oblivious to the details of all this. This last year has been a great catalyst. This is my first venture into this. It has for a while, but it has certainly accelerated my interest in trying to explore and understand this. And my thanks to both of you. Gary, thank you for joining us again. I appreciate your knowledge and your perspective. And again, as we've said, as Rob and I have said many, many times to anyone listening to this, our goal here is to get you to think. We want people not just to default into the kinds of information streams and echo chambers that you've always lived in. We don't want to just accept things that have been handed to us in the past. We want to actually stop and say, these are critical issues that we need to thoughtfully and prayerfully think through. So you don't have to agree with us on everything, but our goal is for you to listen and enter into the conversation. And so you were always welcome feedback and those kinds of things. So send us your comments and questions. You got the determinedtruth.com website there. Rob, any closing remarks before we go?
Not really. Make sure I'm not muted. Thanks again, Gary. We do have a couple comments referring to AIPAC, and I've written some blogs on this recently. I read a blog again that came out today. Go to determinedtruth.com to read those, and want to thank you guys for tuning in. Gary, we can't thank you enough. We appreciate so much your time. And
good to be with you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Take care, everyone.
All right.